Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started with our webinar. The Mountain Plains Prevention Technology Transfer Center at the University of Utah is excited to welcome you to our 6-part webinar emphasis on adolescence. A recording of this webinar will be posted on our website at pttcnetwork.org/Mountain Plains. Slides of this presentation in PDF format will also be posted on our website. For those of you interested in a certificate following today's webinar, please email mountainplains_PTTC@utah.edu. NAIADAC approval is pending. For all other licensure and credentials, please apply directly to your board. All participants have been muted. We encourage you to use the chat feature for questions and messages. Following the webinar, you will see a link in the chat feature along with a QR code to complete a survey. The survey is required for all training events funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They want to know how well we provide our services, and we want your feedback to help us improve our trainings. The information you provide is confidential. We ask that you please take a few minutes to complete the GIPRA evaluation form. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Erin Fisher is a faculty member in the Educational Psychology Department of the College of Education at the University of Utah and works with schools across Utah to build and sustain contemporary behavior and social-emotional programs, both in elementary and secondary settings. Dr. Fisher also has an appointment in the University of Utah School of Medicine's Department of Psychiatry, where he is the director of their Pediatric Feeding Disorders Clinic. It is my pleasure to turn the time over to Dr. Erin Fisher.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here this morning with all of you. Thanks for joining. We will have some time at the end for questions, but please use the chat feature to ask your questions that you might have along the way. Okay, so the talk this morning, we will be focusing on using technology in school prevention. And this is an area that I'm really passionate about. Much of my research interests lie around the integration of contemporary technology in the practice of behavior and mental health services in schools. And today I'm going to give you somewhat of an overview of how technology can be used in these services. And let me give you a little bit of an overview. As we jump in, I wanted to give a shout out to the University of Utah Technology and Training Consultation Lab at the University of Utah. This shown here is the amazing members of our lab that do a variety of different services. And I want to take a few minutes to kind of talk about what those services are. We provide multi-tiered behavior supports and consultation. And really, for the bulk of the first half of this webinar this morning, we'll be talking a lot about what those services look like and how we can help support schools around prevention efforts. We also work teleconsultation where we collaborate with special education teachers in districts across the state of Utah to build capacity and empower them with skills to work with their students with behavior and social emotional problems and other disabilities that impede their ability to be successful during the school day. We also spend a lot of our time providing schools with professional development. And as you can imagine, especially since you're all here joining us today, professional development is a really important aspect. And when you're thinking about teachers and school staff who are dealing with a lot of very important frontline issues, ongoing professional development is critical. And we're pretty excited that we get to work with over 8 school districts in Utah to help provide some of those professional development opportunities. We also do a lot of work around functional assessment and function-based treatment planning. This would be heavily influenced from a behavioral psychology approach. And what we do is we work with students and teachers to try to understand why problem behaviors and issues occur in schools. Typically, this would be much more aggressive behaviors, and we provide treatments that support that. The last two are some of our newer projects that have a much more mental health focused spin and really embody a lot of the prevention efforts that we're trying to do in our local Utah schools. And hopefully that you all can get inspired from and potentially use some of the same services to improve students and children and adolescents that you all might work with. We provide a multi-tiered school mental health program, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then we have an integrated public school day treatment program. And this would be for students who have some of those most acute needs within school districts, typically being sent out to a day treatment program in a medical setting. Here in Utah, we have a psychiatric institute that has day treatment programs. And so school districts, in collaboration with our team, have decided that they want to try to keep those students in schools to try to provide those services. So that's a little bit about our team and what we do. And I'm going to jump in with a little bit of an overview about what we'll be focusing on today. First, we're going to talk about behavior and mental health concerns in schools overall, and why those issues are important and why we should focus on those. Then we'll talk about models that are developed to address these concerns and what type of interventions are included in those models. We'll next talk about using technology for prevention efforts and how you can leverage certain technologies to make your jobs easier, to help students access important mental health services that maybe they can't otherwise. And then talking about technology-based prevention for schools. And we're going to highlight here in Utah some of the excellent services that are technology-based that are driving prevention efforts in our state. Okay, so when we think about mental health and behavior concerns overall, we know that adolescents are increasingly becoming more impacted by mental health concerns. If you all take a second and think back to your time being adolescents, you probably remember it was a pretty awkward time. There were definitely a lot of issues around figuring your life out, dealing with emotions, coping skills. Those were all probably varyingly taught in your adolescence. And so we know that because these increasing issues are more apparent, we need to be able to help them. And we're seeing this if we kind of look in our society now, we're seeing these huge increases, much more than in years past, of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, some of these more really profound issues that affect our youth. And if these issues are left untreated, it can really adversely affect the adolescent's ability to be successful in their academic achievement. It also affects physical health and can ultimately lead to things like dropout, incarceration, these really, really problematic outcomes, when we know that if we can address some of these mental health issues, they have the opposite effect. We see better academic success. They're achieving more. We see improved physical health. We see more pro-social behaviors when it comes to peer interactions. And we see less dropout and less incarceration. So we know that we really need to try to address these things. Mental health problems will likely continue if they're untreated in adolescence into the adult life. Like anything, if we don't deal with those things, if we put Band-Aids on them, if we temporarily try to treat those things but don't get to the root cause, we will have these issues persist. And this is when it becomes incredibly problematic. And so from a prevention standpoint and from our efforts in schools, we want to help these students as early on as possible. And so our services start as early as elementary school, but we really want to try to be able to get them at any point within that continuum, because our goal is to make sure they have the skills, the social emotional skills, the coping skills, the problem solving skills before they leave to go to college or career or whatever they might do after leaving their primary schooling. Over 80% of adults in the United States report struggling with mental health problems, with many of these conditions having onset during adolescence. And so when we track some of this data and talk to individuals and say, hey, when did anxiety start for you? Or when did you start becoming depressed? What was those traumatic events that happened? Well, a lot of them stem back to those years. And as you can imagine, a child in adolescence time from 6 through 18, those are incredibly formative years in anyone's life. And so not being able to deal with those things, having them persist into adulthood, can have some really profound impacts. It's estimated that 1/3 of all school-age children fail to receive mental health supports. And this is a staggering statistic because these are just the estimates. So not necessarily people who report it. For those who are reporting, it ends up being a little bit less. As you can imagine, you have to be pretty vulnerable and open and comfortable. And a lot of the individuals that we work with in schools don't even know how to use the language to describe how they're feeling these things or some of the issues that they're having. And so this number, 1/3, is really high, and we need to do a better job of addressing these issues so that they don't lead to further problems. In 2016 alone, less than half of the 3.1 million adolescents with depression in the US received treatment. That is such a huge number of people not receiving treatment. And as you can imagine, those are the individuals who are very at risk for committing suicide, for having substance use issues, for having other profound mental health and social problems that could lead to really negative outcomes. When we think about substance use prevention for adolescents, substance use is inextricably connected with mental health. And it can be used as a coping mechanism for untreated mental health issues, but substance use can also result in greater likelihood of mental health issues later in life. And so we know that connection's there. We've seen the impact of substance use. And here in Utah, we have an extremely large opiate use compared to other states. And so we are also looking at that and thinking about how can we help support our adolescents in Utah as well as nationally with better, sustainable, pro-social skills that don't ultimately end up being substances or other means to cope. Substance use is associated with poor outcomes in behavior as well as academic success. This sounds similar, as you can imagine, to mental health issues, and some of those issues including an increased likelihood of dropping out of school. So if we're already having mental health issues, and this puts us at risk for all those negative school outcomes like academic success, being able to socialize appropriately, being able to have access to those opportunities, and then we layer in substance use on top of that, we are really exacerbating symptoms and we're really making the problem even more complicated. Substance use in children and adolescents is correlated with increases in suicide, mental health symptoms and diagnoses, and criminal activity in adolescence, young adulthood, and beyond. And as a school-based practitioner, this one piece is so important for me. If we can disrupt people from being incarcerated, and if we know that the people with mental health issues, with disabilities, with substance use problems are at a higher proportionate likelihood to be incarcerated, we need to do a better job to get them the mental health supports early. I want to take a little bit of time just to kind of review in light of some of those problems that we talked about, those risk and protective factors and how we could potentially think about these things in our approach moving forward to treating but more importantly, preventing these issues in schools. So let's take some time and review a little bit. The risk factors, these are characteristics within an individual or conditions in the family, school, or community that increase the likelihood someone will engage in unhealthy behavior. So these are things that make it more likely, higher probability that something bad is going to happen. Something bad being something antisocial in the community, something that's harmful to the self or to others. And these could be things like alcohol, tobacco use, other drugs, violence, suicide, early sexual activity. Those all would increase those outcomes. The more risk factors present in a child's life, the greater the likelihood problems will develop in adolescence. And we have really great ways of assessing some of these things through childhood trauma and other screening tools to look at. When we think about protective factors, these would be characteristics within the individual or conditions in the family, school, or community that help someone cope successfully with life changes. These would be the things that we want. The more of these things, the more likely we will be to be successful. When people can successfully negotiate their problems and deal with pre-existing risk factors, they are less likely to engage in unhealthy behavior. And these protective factors are instrumental in healthy development because they build resiliency, skills, and connections. And you're going to hear this as we kind of go through the webinar today, this idea of social connectiveness and connections. That really is the theme of this prevention work when we're thinking about how do we help adolescents. Many of the adolescents we work with are lacking that social connectedness or whatever connectedness that they perceive to be important that we know drives some of these positive outcomes. Okay, so let's dive into risk factors a little bit more. We're going to do the same with those protective factors. We can look at these risk factors as individual characteristics, family characteristics, school, and community. And I want to go through each of these and kind of talk a little bit about the influence that these might have. When we think about the individual and their peers, experienced child abuse, physical or sexual or other other family violence. These risk factors are going to have an impact on the individual. And for those of you who work with adolescents, if you're working in public schools, you know that abuse and neglect and other family violence is occurring at an extremely high rate, particularly when we're in schools that are more at risk, these Title I schools, where they have a higher proportionate number of students who experience poverty, and all the other risk factors like mental health, poor parent involvement, substance use of parents, mental health illness of parents, and the list goes on. When we have early initiation of problem behavior, this we also know is a big risk factor, and loss of cultural identity and connection. These are really big ones that can influence an individual's outcomes. And the list goes on about a variety of other ones. And as you can imagine, these top three are really impactful for the adolescent. When we think about family risk factors, death by suicide of a friend or family member, this can be incredibly impactful, particularly for an adolescent who's trying to figure out their day-to-day. They're trying to figure out their identity and who they are and what their values are. And when people commit suicide who they know or love or care deeply about, it really makes people question those values and those beliefs and the things that they thought were important to them, and can have much more of a risk. Family history of problem behavior, family management problems, family conflict. As you can imagine, if you come home from a place and it's tumultuous, it is unpredictable, it is really hard to have clear expectations and sustainability of the positive things that you want to have in place in a family structure. In school, the academic failure is going to be huge. You reduce self-efficacy. If I feel like I'm a bad student, I'm not going to try as hard because I don't understand the benefit. I can get a hopeless attitude. If I have a lack of personal commitment to school, I don't know why this is important to me. And maybe I start allocating my behavior to things that are more antisocial in the community, potentially maybe being involved in a gang, because I'm trying to seek some validation, some self-efficacy that I'm not achieving through the school. And then the community would be the availability of substances, community norms and laws, availability of firearms, poverty, and some of the other things that I had mentioned. So these risk factors are there, and many, many, many children experience these things. If you look at the socioeconomic distribution, these tend to occur more when we talked about in these areas that have higher poverty, but don't get me wrong, these things are happening, and it's important for all of our students. As far as protective factors go, we can think about the individual peers as engagement in meaningful activities. This is so, so important. When individuals are going through elementary school and early secondary, they are trying to figure out what makes them happy and what they can get involved with that is going to give them that reinforcement. And so finding lots of great opportunities for peers to get involved, things that make them feel valued, these are all things that we can think about doing to help protect and to help build some resiliency in adolescence. Life skills and social competence. This is where the social emotional learning piece comes in that we're going to talk about in a little bit. This is a protective factor. If you know how to navigate tough social situations, if you know how to get by doing things in life that are really important, you have an ability to be successful in ways that individuals who don't have those skills cannot. Cultural identity and connection. This is so, so important. With the youth we're working with in our current social political landscape, I think cultural identity and connection is so important. And when we're thinking about children and adolescents being able to have conversations around these things and have connectedness around these things, it can be incredibly helpful. The variety of other items to think about would be positive personal qualities, like being really resilient, positive self-concept, how you're perceiving yourself, peer role models. So who are the kids hanging out with? That's kind of one of the biggest factors that we'd like to consider. Religious identity. This is going to be really important because it can provide that connectiveness. High grade point average. So if you're very high achieving, of course, you're going to have that self-efficacy. It's going to drive those positive outcomes. Again, family connectiveness. If we look to family, this is such an important piece. If we had all those risk factors before with family engaging in a poor way or not at all, or making it dysfunctional, if we can have appropriate attachment, consistent attachment and relationships around these things, that can be really, really positive. Positive parenting style, having 2 or more parents in a family, higher parent education, high parental expectations about school, those are all going to be protective. When it comes to school, connected to school. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about how do we build school connectedness, because this in and of itself is the prevention piece that is so important. And after we lay the stage of why school connectedness is important, we're going to talk about how we can integrate technology to execute some of those things in an efficient way. When we go down looking at student participation in extracurricular activities, again, this would be things that students can feel good about, that they can practice, that they can have reinforcing experiences with. And last in the community, positive connection with other adults, safe, supportive neighborhoods, strong community infrastructure, local state policies that support healthy norms and range of opportunities in the community for youth engagement. If you look through these protective factors, the connection piece is so important. Cultural identity and connection, family connectiveness, connected to school, positive connection to other adults. What we know is that the more people can have healthy, positive, connected relationships with other people, that is going to ameliorate so many of these negative outcomes that we see when it comes to adolescence and potential substance use down the road. So let's talk a little bit about school climate. This is such an important term. I don't know if this term is familiar to all of you, or if you've heard it sort of in passing. School climate is really made up of a variety of different areas. It really speaks to the overall feel of the school, and beyond sort of the anecdotal pieces of when you walk through that building and how it feels, those are driven by these domains that we know drive these outcomes. First would be positive discipline. When we think about positive discipline, we're going to talk a little bit more about it in a couple slides. This is around creating clear expectations, having procedures that people can follow, consequences that are logical, that are restorative in nature, and that follow largely a positive behavioral framework, meaning that we're trying to build people up rather than beating them down, teaching people that it's okay to make mistakes while you're learning, as long as you try again after you've made that mistake. Those are the types of discipline strategies we need to have in our schools. The next thing we can think of is school safety for all students. We have to create spaces that promote all students feeling comfortable to learn. If students show up in a place and they aren't comfortable to learn, they're not going to learn. Another consideration would be positive prevention systems and effective interventions. We have to use evidence-based strategies. We have to have systems level infrastructure where administrators are collaborating with teachers and parents to drive outcomes based on data that is informing these things. Another important consideration would be the cultural competence piece. All schools have a unique culture, and the populations that are locally surrounding those schools and feeding those schools students have their own unique cultural influence. It is important for schools to understand how the culture of that school influences learning outcomes and what schools can do to foster the unique culture that's in place. I see schools as drivers of the community. They have to be places that empower cultural acceptance, differences in culture, and those unique equitable efforts that we have to make to ensure that students from diverse backgrounds and minority youth are being addressed. Another important piece of school climate is this home-school collaboration piece. And we'll talk a little bit about some technology strategies that can help facilitate this. But the better schools that I've worked in from prevention efforts always have great communication when it comes to home and school. And to me, if we're thinking of collaboration and prevention work and teaming, it all stems on our ability to communicate effectively around these things. And last but not least, like we talked about before, is this idea of school connectedness. To the extent that students walk into the school and feel connected with the people around them and their peers, they will want to be there. They will want to learn. They will want to engage in the extracurricular activities, and they will want to engage in pro-social behaviors. If we don't create a connected environment, they will try to seek those things in the community and through means that are not as beneficial, that have contraindicated outcomes, meaning that will make things worse, things like substance use. So the idea about how to address this school climate really stems from about 20 years of research in the areas of multi-tiered systems of support or positive behavior supports. These tend to be synonyms. The multi-tiered system of support is essentially an umbrella term that is encompassed by the idea of responsiveness to interventions or a positive behavior framework, meaning that we have tiered systems that build on top of each other. And all students are taught certain behavioral expectations and rewarded for following them. And students with more needs are provided increasingly intensive interventions to ensure success happens at that student level. Positive behavior supports are based upon behavioral and biomedical science, using this model of triaging more intensive need with hopefully fewer services. It's definitely hinged on applied behavior analysis research and has demonstrated the importance of analyzing the interaction between behavior and the environment. This is such an important piece, and implementing intervention strategies that are effective in natural everyday settings. And they have 3 tiers that make up their system. You can conceptualize this system as a prevention model. And so as we break in these models and look at them a little bit more, hopefully these triangles, or the idea about a tiered system of support, is somewhat familiar. This infographic essentially breaks it down for behavior, but I want you guys to kind of break some of those barriers down. When we think about multi-tiered systems of support, positive behavior support, social emotional learning, we're really talking about similar things. It's just how are we focusing the application of the work we're doing. These infographics will break down some of the common barriers to implementing PBS, but what I really want you to focus on for these slides is the ideal behavior model and then some of these ineffective tiered behavior models. And I'm going to walk you through each of them. So we're thinking about prevention models in schools. We want to make sure that we are putting the biggest amount of resources and getting the biggest bang for our buck out of that tier 1 foundational universal support level. That would be in green when we look at the triangle. And this would be about 80% of students receiving services. What's really exciting about this model is that we can train teachers to deliver behavioral and social emotional supports in their classroom as a way to address all students. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in some of the curricula that are associated with that in a little bit. At the tier 2 level, ideally, this would be less students receiving a little bit more of an intensive need, but we'd only expect 15% of students to get these services. And I'll talk a little bit more about what specific services would be in each tier in the next couple slides. At the tier 3 level, we would expect 5% of students, a much smaller proportion, high intensity of services. And so when we're doing this system correctly, we're putting all of our effort to affect most students and putting in commensurate effort that's needed, but far less than we would if we were doing this incorrectly. So if we look at the left, that's the ideal behavioral model. I want you to take a second and look now on the right. These are our 2 ineffective tiered behavior models or tiered mental health models. The first one, this is one I see often in schools, is the hourglass model. Typically what will happen is they have some semblance of tier 1 supports. They may have some school-wide programming, something that all teachers are doing. Maybe they collect data as a whole, but there's not really much going on at the tier 2 level. And remember, the tier 2 level, these would be for students who are at risk. This is not all the way the student with acute need yet, that tier 3 level. These are students who just need some group instructions, some brief interactions to help maintain and help support that they don't develop any worse symptoms or have any problems down the road. When that's missing, what tends to happen is that all those students who probably could have been served at the tier 2 are now pushed up into the tier 3 level, and we start to see a strong emphasis on individual intensive services. Now, this is great. I love the idea of students getting one-on-one individual services. But in a school system, and if we're thinking about prevention efforts, it's not an efficient use of our time and efforts if we're doing direct service, when many of those students at the direct level could benefit the same way if they receive services in a group format. So again, bang for our buck and thinking about working smarter and not harder. The last model I want you to check out would be this upside down triangle. And as you can imagine, the triangle on the left being the correct, the ideal triangle. We want to avoid this upside down triangle at all costs. When I mentioned those problems about tier 3 supports and allocating all of our efforts, essentially trying to put out fires and deal with those high acuity needs, we never have enough effort or support to build those foundational capacities, which really take the temperature down and allow us to effectively deal with those fewer students at those higher need levels. And so if you are working in sites trying to do prevention efforts, a lot of the work could just be trying to get them to have their school climate and school culture follow this more positive behavior ideal triangle where we're seeing 80-15-5 distribution. Okay, so that sets the stage a little bit about these frameworks and how we're going to approach these things from a prevention lens. I want to talk a little bit from a mental health perspective with adolescents about what those services look like and how we as mental health practitioners and providers can help support schools to do some of this work. I will say that this requires funding to be able to do this. Luckily in Utah, we have a legislature and local school boards that are really, really focused on improving mental health access and prevention efforts in schools. And so because of that, we've been able to really tap into these communities and help support. The project that I'm describing is also funded by the Cambia Health Foundation, which has graciously given us funding to support what we're talking about here in this slide for the next 2 years. I'm going to start at the bottom and I'm going to work my way up talking about what supports are there. And then once I finish talking about supports, I'll talk a little bit about those arrows you see on the triangle on the right that talk about some of the referral processes. But the tier 1 level, when we think about prevention efforts, what we're doing is trying to deal with mental health, because if we can deal with mental health, we can hopefully reduce substance use issues as a symptom of the apparent mental health problem. So what we would do is have social emotional learning through Second Step. Second Step is a program that we subscribe to, and they don't pay us. We have no investment with that company, but we find that the tools that they provide are really, really robust. They're easy for teachers to use immediately. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about that program in a few slides. We also provide school-wide social emotional attitudes and values. And so we're trying to create in the school level, in collaboration with administrators, school counselors, and other school staff, the values and beliefs that we want to be apparent to develop that school climate in the school. And these things would be school rules, reinforcement systems, positive behavior interventions, and interactions that they have with teachers. If you're thinking about elementary school, this is really a lot of the time what's in place. We want these things in place, but when we're thinking about secondary students, adolescents, this is just the foundation, the behavioral rules. Now we're doing much more sophisticated social emotional learning that really has profound impact on these students. We're also working on things like school culture, like we talked about, class-wide psychoeducation around individual issues that may come up during a school year. We focus a lot on teacher well-being by providing yoga groups for our teachers each week. We also have quarterly family involvement so they can come for trainings and other skills that they can learn so they can be involved in this process overall. We also have a ton of communication using technology, which I'll talk about in a little bit when we talk about some of the technology integrations. At the tier 2 level, teachers should make student referrals to school counselors. And then what happens is the school counselor makes a referral to our well-being team. WBT is the name of our program. We didn't want to take a strictly mental health focus, so we talked about it in a much more global well-being. And what we do after getting that referral is we meet with students for a 20-minute check-in. I will mention a little bit more about that in a second, but really in that 20-minute check-in, this is an interview that we can ask students about suicidal ideation or trauma. We want to rule out some of these really high acuity behaviors so we can make sure that we're meeting their need. And then based on students' global well-being, the student may receive either individual psychotherapy or groups depending on how they're triaged. Students remaining at the tier 2 level will have bi-monthly check-ins with a qualified mental health graduate provider who tends to be a graduate student in training. And then the student well-being is monitored over time. So we kind of have this ability to connect to the extent that the student needs. And then last but not least, at this tier 3 level, referrals can come from students themselves, guardians, and or teachers. And students at this level receive therapy for acute needs, including major depression, psychosis, active suicidal ideation. If it's beyond the scope of what we could handle, we always refer out to community providers. And we always have resources available if these students need or their parents need. If they show a lack of interest, we can always push them into a tier 2 support so they can be with peers in a group. What's really important is you have these multiple opportunities for students to communicate, to get information out about their need, and try to help them at whatever spot they're at. What we try to focus to is we want to make sure that when people are making referrals for these students is that we're focusing on symptoms and not diagnosing. we really are trying to teach people to normalize the culture of social emotional learning and mental health. It has such a stigma as mental health providers. Many of you probably experience similar things. And so we're trying to break some of these barriers down and stop, victimizing or demonizing people for being anxious or depressed or being worried. These are normal things that people experience, and we want to talk about it in constructive ways. So this really gives an idea of what services are there, and I'll dive in a little bit more about some of the specific services in a little bit. As we continue to jump into social emotional learning and considering the way we triage those services at the tiered model, the framework that we're really adhering to is one that's put forth by CASTLE, which is one of the largest social emotional learning nonprofit organizations. And they've come up with this framework that adheres to that social ecological model. So if you guys are familiar with Bradford Brenner, this would be his model that has been adapted when we think about social emotional learning. And so in the middle, there's this idea about social emotional academic learning. That is, the core foundational important elements of being successful as a student in schools. And the pieces that make those things up are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. These are the critical, you could almost consider them these pivotal behaviors that have profound impacts if people can master these. Now, these are all couched within classroom curriculum and instruction, school climate, policies and practices, and family community partnerships. So having this idea that they all interact is really, really important. So let's talk more about social emotional learning and break it down to some of these main areas. First, they want to identify emotions and self-regulation. The focus of SEL is to help children gain mastery over feelings, thoughts, and behavior to increase confidence and self-esteem. You'd be surprised. I mean, I think a lot of the adolescents that we'd work with don't really have the language. They probably have thought about these things, but maybe didn't associate it with it being a certain emotion or feeling. And we may be surprised with that, but unless these things are explicitly taught in a constructive and evidence-based way, there can be some missed messages, there can be some information that falls through the cracks, and they just may not be able to develop the proficiency needed without appropriate instruction. I think along the way, we've forgotten that kids need to learn these things. And unfortunately, parents are less equipped because they maybe not have the skills. And so we're starting to see this kind of trickle down effect where we now need to really provide some more of these supports. Building empathy and peer connections. We can assist students in building empathy and understanding for others and how to form healthy peer relationships. This is really important. We have a big bullying culture, unfortunately, in schools. And I think it's trying to break a lot of those down through positive and empathic peer connections. A lot of social emotional learning programs are really hinged on this idea of empathy. And as you can imagine, being able to put yourself in someone's shoes is a really, really impactful experience and exercise. Respecting boundaries, teach proper boundaries and other skills such as respect, compassion, and other things that really drive pro-social relationships. Promote positive mental health, demystifying some of the stigmas, but also understanding what mental health is and techniques that you can use to cope and deal with difficult emotions, who you can talk to, how you can navigate the difficulty that comes along with those things. And then decision-making and problem solving, learning how to effectively make choices and apply the problem-solving framework to daily life. We all do this instantaneously. Again, if we aren't explicitly teaching kids how to make good choices and problem solve, particularly when times might be hard for them to make those decisions, we're gonna have potential negative outcomes, including choices like substance use. Okay, so let's jump in and talk a little bit more about each of those levels and some of the specific stuff that we can do at each of those levels from a prevention standpoint. And as we go through this, I'm going to kind of sprinkle in some of the technology aspects that you could use as well. The idea of universal prevention is school-wide. This is how do we make social emotional learning, empathy, positive relationships, problem solving, how do we have this happen at the school level? Well, it means that everyone has to do those things. And to do that, everyone has to start paying attention more. So you'll take notice. Everyone has to connect. Teachers have to say hi to students. They have to talk to them. They have to ask them how they're doing and genuinely care. They have to prepare for their lessons so that they can be more available to connect with the students. They have to be active. They have to have activities that are going on. You want people to be physically active because that's going to promote the well-being that we want. We also have to be generous and giving. We have to conduct ourselves in our interactions with the students, with other staff, whoever it may be. We have to present a positive and supportive attitude. We have to, teach from a loving place, unconditional place, rather than an area of resentment. We have to be able to take that approach to be successful in schools. And we have to have this idea that we can keep learning. We can make mistakes. I mentioned this before. So many adolescents and children are scared to make mistakes and do things wrong because they don't want to be reprimanded. It's because we create space in a culture where people do get reprimanded for making mistakes and are made to feel bad for making the mistake or doing the wrong thing. And schools need to do a better job of recognizing that learning can only happen when mistakes happen. And to the extent that we can support people, we can drive some of those positive outcomes. So again, this all feeds into the climate. How can we create this whole environment that makes people want to come to school and makes them want to be connected and do well, and allocate their behavior to the pro-social, positive things, rather than the stuff that's going to hinder them and lead to substance use or incarceration or dysfunction in their family or peers. My go-to program, like I mentioned before, is Second Step. And I really like Second Step because, as you can see in this picture, it gives you all the materials. It has videos. It makes it super easy for any teacher who has a limited amount of time to just go onto the website, push play, and facilitate it with their class. This example is one of the posters that's up through their bullying lesson. And in this, they kind of talk through what you should do and the power that you can have as a bystander. And so let's kind of walk through this. First would be to recognize that there's a problem. Then you would have to report that problem to an adult, and then you refuse to engage in that, to not participate in bullying, because we all have to be able to take care of our own behaviors. And if we do that, hopefully we can decrease some of the effect that it might have. And then the power of the bystander, which they talk about, would be reporting help, standing up for someone, being kind, and how that's a respectful thing to do, and including everyone. And again, I think the most important thing we can do in schools is to teach kids to promote connectiveness, promote inclusiveness, to stand up for people when there's injustice. Those are really powerful things that we need to teach our youth so that they can be successful in navigating their lives. Here are some other posters that Second Step offers. What's really great too that I didn't mention was that this program goes all the way from kindergarten through 8th grade, and it has unique individualized content and videos and materials for each grade. So depending on where you're at in this prevention continuum, as far as the age range, you can find programming through this to address it. And it looks at things like how to calm down, how to pay attention, how to problem solve, how to develop empathy. And these would be posters for younger children, kind of some of the more mid to late elementary. But as you can imagine, these are really tangible, and the program does a really nice way of teaching this through behavioral skills training. And for those who are unfamiliar, that would be the I do, we do, you do, tell, show, do, having that really evidence-based teaching strategy. Okay. Moving on to the Tier 2 targeted prevention, what we do is we do a lot of group therapies, brief check-ins, and electronic school home note as a way to do connectedness. And let me talk a little bit about those. With group therapies, we're looking at things like important issues that impact a population. And so for the schools that we work in, there are unique social emotional problems, societal problems, community problems that we have to address. You should always be open for that when you're doing your prevention work. Some of the stuff that we focus on, and these acronyms are ones, some that we made up and some that are existing proprietary products, and I'll make sure to differentiate as we go through. One that we are in the process of developing is called ROAM, and this focuses on essentially acceptance and commitment treatment. So we'd focus on things like relaxation, observation, acceptance, mindfulness, values. We call it ROAM, but we're really trying to focus on individuals who are anxious, so that we can help build some resilience around some of the anxiety that may be experiencing. We run Peers, which is a proprietary social relational program for adolescents. We also have advanced decision-making and problem-solving for teens, which is an excellent manualized program by Jason Burrows-Sanchez that focuses on adolescent support around these critical aspects that you can imagine: problem-solving, decision-making. If we can get them to make those decisions when they're feeling more depressed or anxious, and then someone potentially exposes them to a substance and says, hey, I want you to try this, they are hopefully better positioned to be successful. And then last is another group that we've developed or that we've borrowed through a local partner here in the Salt Lake Valley. The program's called Stand Up, and it's around female empowerment. We also have the check-ins. What I mentioned about this is an opportunity for us to have those biweekly meetings where we meet for 20 minutes to follow up on some of those important information around symptoms or potential psychopathology. Again, individuals who are engaging in this are more at risk. What we'd like to do to incorporate technology with this is have more web-based opportunities for check-ins. So like a survey that is sent. We can also like to start incorporating more teleconsultation for check-ins. That brief time-limited check-in, we know through the teleconsultation literature would be a great augment to this. And so we want to start doing a little bit of research to see in what ways we could actually help support in a more time-limited capacity. And then last but not least, at that tier 2 kind of targeted level is this idea of electronic home note. Again, this would not be all students at your school. So we're thinking about 15%. If you had 100 students, you're thinking about almost 15 who would be able to get this additional intervention. And this is just an example, but what the teachers would be able to do throughout the day is fill out a Google form or Qualtrics or whatever survey that you would use at your school or your agency, and teachers can fill it out and then parents can fill it out. And it's a nice way to have great communication between school and home. And if you're an agency provider trying to help with prevention efforts, this might be another great way to follow through with clients. And there's some really great literature showing the benefit of getting parent involvement. It really is that driving force for student outcomes. And this is a nice way considering how ubiquitous technology is today. At the tier 3 level, we provide individual prevention efforts around individual therapy. And although this is treatment still, typically when we're working with these adolescents, there isn't as much substance use as if they were older later in life, so 18 and beyond, having those similar mental health issues. I feel like we still have this ability to get in there and help support. And so we still consider this much more prevention efforts, especially with substance use, because we could be working with people who are potentially anxious, depressed, or experience trauma and not yet coping in really negative ways. So hopefully that provides some context to how we're providing these in a prevention conceptually. So who facilitates these prevention efforts with students? If we think more globally outside of just some of the work that we've done here, it's really anyone you can think of at the school. Certain people are primed more with the technical expertise, and these would be people like social workers, school counselors, school psychologists. But we also want to loop people in like school administrators and teachers, parents and caregivers, community agencies, in collaboration with public schools. These are all people who can do it, and it really takes the village to be able to do these prevention efforts for adolescents. If only one of these people are doing it, it's not happening school-wide. If community is not involved, we are just not going to have the same success. And I'll tell you what, when everyone on this list is clicking and working together to have a similar outcome for students, the positive benefits are amazing. And if you have the opportunity to see it, it is just phenomenal when you can get everyone working collaboratively. Okay, so with the last bit of time that we have this morning, I really want to highlight a little bit more about technology and some of our technology efforts, and particularly focusing on one of the apps that we use here in Utah that was developed through the College of Medicine and the hospital here on campus. So the problem is the lack of access to care, shortage of mental health providers, financial barriers, geographic access, and the solution to it is really technology-based prevention efforts for children. And with ubiquitous technologies and smartphones, computers, so much great technology is really available at our fingertips, and what we can do with it is still just being created. I mean, there's endless applications that we can promote efficiency. So when we think about prevention efforts, we can think about technology, thinking about when prevention and treatment, including social emotional learning, positive behavior supports, and those things are delivered in the form of technological interventions, including apps, texting, and other technology platforms, which we'd consider sort of this definition, we can see those positive outcomes. And when prevention efforts are integrated through technology, there's an enhanced ability to reach a wider audience for a lower cost than traditional prevention efforts. So this is really, really exciting. What we know through some of the positive outcomes of including technology is that there's overall satisfaction and positive outcomes with when people integrate tech use. So if they're using apps to help their treatment, augmenting their treatment through apps or video conferencing, the e-home note, like I told you about earlier, we are seeing reduced symptomology and enhanced access to care, which is just amazing. If we're looking at who wants to interact with technology-based interventions, we see a preference for younger individuals, although I think as time goes on and people will become more inherently proficient with technology, I think we'll start to see technology-based prevention efforts and interventions becoming much more ubiquitous in mental health and behavior health and our medical system. Cost savings are there. It's extremely helpful to have automated processes that can provide evidence-based care. Considering there's shortages of mental health providers, this is really something that's important. Increased access, that's so important, especially for folks in remote or underserved areas. Enhance practitioner capacity. You can collect data in ways that you maybe couldn't before, and improve quality of life for individuals you work with. So let's talk a little bit about current technology and prevention efforts, highlighting an app called SafeUT. This is an app that was developed from the medical school here, like I talked about. The SafeUT Crisis Chat and Tip Line is a statewide service that provides real-time crisis intervention to youth through live chat and confidential tip program right from the smartphone. It's free. Licensed clinicians are in a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week crisis line call center to respond to all incoming chats and calls by providing supportive or crisis counseling, suicide prevention, and referral services. They can help anyone with emotional crises, bullying, relationship problems, mental health, or suicide-related issues. This is kind of what the interface of the app looks like. There's a chat or crisis line, there's a call line that can get you someone, and there's also submitting a tip, and this is how you can do tips anonymously, and these would be things like school administrators getting informed about bullying, threats, substance use, violence. The interface looks like this. You can indicate what school you would want to associate it with. They have a list of every school in Utah, and then you can have a chat. Or if you have the tip summary, you select your school, input all the information, and someone gets back to you. Or if it's anonymous, the school administrator is informed of that, and they can act on those things, which, as you can imagine, are incredibly helpful. I've worked with many schools who have used this as a way to screen mental health issues, and it's been an incredible support. We've advocated students we work with in our capacity to use this to make tips because there's issues with reporting and things like that. So it's a really nice system that's in place. Some more about the SafeUT app. It really, the counselors who address these issues, they can focus on topics like depression, anxiety, other mental health issues, suicide prevention, loss and grief, bullying, cyberbullying, drug and alcohol problems, self-harm, relationship difficulties, and any life challenge. And as you can imagine, all those things I listed is like a day in the life of an adolescent dealing with one or more of those things. It's free and confidential, and it's really just a nice tool to really help build. Unfortunately, this is only for Utah, but I would encourage you guys to reach out to other folks because I think it's something that probably does exist in other places. And if it doesn't, it's probably something that could be relatively, I don't want to say easy because that probably is a misstatement, but it's very feasible to create with the right resources in place. Okay, so moving forward, here's a list of this is in no way exhaustive. I'm very interested in all the apps that are constantly being developed, but here's a list of apps you could check out. One that is really cool if you want to look into it is the Calm Harm. It kind of follows the DBT, dialectical behavior therapy framework, and it allows some supports around issues of self-harm and some negative thinking. So check out some of these. These all are available on the App Store or the Android market. And just see what these may do for you. I think we really need like a whole webinar just to even dive into how to evaluate these, but there are so much out there to help around data reporting, symptom management, communication, and I would, as practitioners or folks interested in building this prevention efforts in schools, use these free and robust tools to help your efforts. Okay, with the last few minutes we have, there's some practical considerations to talk about. Privacy and confidentiality when using technology. Clearly, this is an issue. You want to make sure you're using HIPAA and FERPA compliant software because when we're in schools, there's federal privacy guidelines for schools that we have to adhere to. We also want to make sure that there's responsible use of this technology, making sure folks know how to use it without potential problems. Like one of the big issues we see with adolescents in schools right now, and one that I'm really concerned about, is social media. And knowing that it can easily go the wrong direction responsible use, and talking about that's really important. And then training and professional development. You are all here today. If you decide to use technology, make sure you have ongoing training. The technology changes exponentially one year to the next. It's amazing how quickly it progresses. So thank you all for being here to learn and continue those efforts. With my last slide, just a summary. Behavior and mental health concerns are on the rise. Schools are excellent places to provide prevention efforts for children and adolescents, and strong collaborative models produce and emphasize that SEL produce the most positive outcomes. Technology, when effectively used, can provide access to support for those services. And like I mentioned, there are so many great ones that are out there. I'd also like to remind you all that we'll be having another webinar, which is Informing Prevention series, the effects of drug use, such as marijuana, on adolescent brain development. That will be by Dr. Glenn Hansen. And I encourage you guys all to register for that webinar. And with the last few minutes we have today, I'd like to open it up in the chat for any questions or comments you all have. Please check out my website. And if you're interested in learning more about technology applications, here are 2 texts that I've edited with my colleagues that focus on this work in schools. Thank you, everyone, for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. That was a great webinar. Like he said, we'll open the chat for some questions if anyone has any. Yeah, so if you want to go, yeah, perfect. We will remind you that we have our GIPR evaluation. So for those of you that have a QR code app, you can scan the QR code, or you can click the link in the chat box. You'll be provided with a post-evaluation along with an option to complete a 30-day follow-up survey. Okay, there's another question.
Yeah, that's a great question. We do provide professional development credits. It's teacher relicensure credit. And we are able to provide that through our affiliation with the University of Utah, but I imagine that it's probably relatively, I wouldn't say easy again, but it's feasible to be able to set those continuing education opportunities up.
So it looks like Jennifer Hogue, the references, I'm sure Dr. Fisher has those references, yes, and we will send those out. Also, Erin, if you want to go to the next slide, you can find our past webinars on our website if you just go to pttcnetwork.org/Mountain Plains, and then choose the on-demand webinars. Those are where our past webinars are held. Yes. Are there any other questions? All right, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Have a great day.